morning. Welcome back to Spill the Tea. My name is Fauwaz Abdul Aziz. I'm an analyst with Penang Institute's History and Regional Studies Department. With us today is Dato Dr. Beng, Executive Director of Penang Institute. Welcome back, Dr. Uwi.
Thank you.
Okay, so my first question, Dr. Uwi, is I'm hoping to get some words from you that are partly biographical and partly conceptual. I hope to get some ideas, not just about your thoughts, but also about you as a person. So this is in a way to introduce as well as to refamiliarize our listeners with Dr. Uwi as a person. Everybody's interesting, and I think it's particularly fascinating to learn not just about ideas, but also ideas in the context of people's thought processes. So it's not biographical in the sense of details that our listeners can get from an internet search or from the biographical descriptions on the books and articles that you've written, but biographical in the sense of understanding your ideas in the context of your experiences as a person, as a man.
All right.
So now, from the conversations that we've had together, as well as the talks that you've given and articles you've written, it's apparent that nation statehood and nation building are recurrent topics and issues that you grapple with. As a way of introducing yourself and contextualizing this conversation, could you perhaps share with us how and why did nation statehood and nation building become important or salient to you? What was formative in your life prior to this moment that contributed towards making nation statehood and nation building so central in your headspace presently? Why did they become important to you as the person you are now?
Well, everyone gets formatted by childhood experiences, and your question is an important one because it's asking me to try to identify certain memories from my childhood and early years on why issues of nationhood and nation building and so on would stick in my head until today. The two memories I can take up is, one is that I was born in 1955. I think at a time when the British were pulling out and Malaysia was just coming into being. Of course, I don't remember Merdeka. I was only 2 years old, but the whole of society was going through that change, and ideas of Rukun, what's it called? Rukun Tetangga?
Rukun Negara.
Well, and then when I was, how old was I then? About 10 when we had the confrontasi. I remember that very well because even as a 10-year-old, I was out at night looking out for parachutists dropping in on rifle range flats, things like that. Now, that might not have been the most important thing in answering your question, but I think that period of time affected certain young Malaysians in, what is this Malaysia, what is being left behind, what is ahead, and so on. And that was one reason I later on always had a fascination for the leaders in different countries who were like half or one generation older than me, because they were the ones more firmly caught in that line of thinking. I think in that sense I was at the tail end of that. I would think that's one thing I remember. The second thing I remember was when I was surprised at myself then. I was leaving Malaysia to fly off to Stockholm, hoping to study at Stockholm University. And I remember this was the first time I was flying. So I took off from Kuala Lumpur, and I had a notebook with me, and I began to write down certain thoughts. You're leaving your country, so you have certain thoughts about it. And I remember those thoughts quite clearly. It seemed very profound now for someone that young to be thinking about. It was about how every nation, every government wants or needs to create a mentality in its people that suits it. This was before I had set foot in another country to make comparisons. But I suppose in Malaysia, because of the change from colonial to independence, in a way, all Malaysians were living in two countries already, right? And I think that sort of got my head going, and those issues continue going around in my head. And after living abroad in so many different countries, I find it fascinating to consider the human condition in the age of nation states, in the age of new nation states, in the age of rising China, in the age when Western powers are having great self-doubts about themselves and so on. It's a new world for people like us from that generation, and even for younger people like you, I think.
I guess it must have been fascinating. Did you realize, or were you aware that that you were standing on the threshold between the past and the future, between one world? You were saying the colonial world, and then there's a post-colonial world, that you were on kind of like, what they say, you were at a point of liminality between the past and the future.
Right.
Did you have that sense at that time?
Well, I think I've had that sense, and I have that sense about anything in my life, and any aspects really.
We're always in a state of
I think
transition.
everyone has that, right?
Yes.
It's whether you had the time or the inclination later on in life to formulate it for yourself, because where each and every one of us stands, it's always the breaking point between the past and the present.
Yes.
And the mind can easily, if you have some inclination to be historical about yourself and about the world, it's always a turning point.
Yes.
Today is a turning point.
Yes.
Yesterday was a turning point. You know. But I mean, this is half serious. But I think it's not an empty statement.
Yes.
We psychologically are always at that point where we have to act today, and your acting, including your reformulation of yourself and your experiences, actually changes tomorrow compared to yesterday.
Yeah. Well, talking about the past, the present, and the future, just to relate what you just said, what is it about the past and the present that make these two concepts, nation statehood and nation building, so important? You think? Did you the problems that you saw in the past, or the issues or the challenges that you saw in the past, do you think that they are still salient today? What, how are they linked? What is different about the past from present day Malaysia that we maybe should appreciate, and how are they linked to the future? Are there some things that we should hold on to and not forget or keep in mind, or there are some things that we should maybe realize that, well, that's part of a past world, past life, past time, and we should deal with different things now?
I think by inclinations, since I was a young teenager, I think I've been somewhat journalistic in my thinking. Journalistic in the sense that I wanted to know the world, understand the world, formulate what I know about it in ways that I could communicate. I think that was always in the back of my mind. My first career was here in Penang as a journalist, working for the Star and then for the Straits Echo. So that influenced me greatly. I tend to think that your first job sort of forms you more deeply than you might think. Where nation states and so on are concerned, I suppose the broader picture is the issue. It becomes philosophy. It becomes political philosophy. It becomes philosophy in itself. It becomes very much about the humanities. So you're looking at the present and the flux in the present. As an intellectual, in the end, you're also looking for more general statements about humans, society, and so on. And as you grow older, I've a few degrees, because in a way I couldn't decide what was good for me, I suppose. And I never looked for a career. In living in Sweden, you're not going to be starving or anything, and therefore, if you're interested in academic subjects, you just go around doing different courses, and in the end, you don't know what you are. But nations, of course, when we talk about nation states, you have to immediately think of how that is different, how this age is different from earlier ages.
Yes.
So I always think there's a tension between the imperial element and the nationhood element, right? And what is a state and what is a nation, what is society and what is its government, what is the relationship between these two. These are very salient points that are hard to answer. I once wrote an article, not a very good one or deep one, but about nation-state, state-nation, nation-state, state-nation, that there's a continual process. And whenever you come into the picture, you might think you're coming in with nation as a given, and that nation is looking for a state, that kind of thing. Or you can come in at another point where the state is just being formed, there is no no real nation yet, and so you start thinking the form of state-nation, for example. Things like that. So to pick on examples close at hand, I tend to think if you compare Malaysia and Singapore, which we always tend to do in many cases, the Malaysian nation-building project went with the nation-state idea. First the nation, then the state. And then this nation seeks expression in a state. And then you have to define what that nation actually is. And so our problems come out of the fact that there is not one nation, there are many nations, because we are a mix of nation states and state nations built in the past.
Yes.
So we have the Indians here, we have the Chinese here.
Yes.
And then you have the Malays and so on and so forth. So quite a mix. So if you are going to go with this nation state idea, you're going to get trouble because you can't decide on the nation, let alone the state. And then you get a state that makes use of the fact that the nations are divided, and therefore you perpetuate conflict because you're using this, what you assume to be over time a unifying concept, nation state. So you're caught in that. If I compare that to a much newer nation like Singapore, there is much clearer. It's a state nation. It is a state trying to create Singaporeanness. That's going to take a few generations, but that's what they're doing. So you see the two different contexts going on. If you're living in Europe, then you see that you have these nations, but they were built by states a few hundred years ago.
Yes.
And then they've gone on long enough, so their people think of their nationhood as given, and the state is simply representing this nation that is quite stable. It could be Swedish, it could be whatever. The English one is quite complex because it's been conquered so many times and it's such a complex society. Its language is highly complex and so on. But if you take a more peripheral country in Europe, like the Scandinavian countries, there you get the simpler idea of a nation looking for a state that is an expression of it. Now things are changing. They are becoming multicultural and have all the problems that come with that. But the concepts are still there, quite strong. And that's why in a country like Sweden, you can imagine the state being perfected because you didn't think of the nationhood as a problem. The nationhood was the given one. And then you try to create a state that reflects exactly what its people want. And so democracy in its pure form would look like that. Democracy in itself does not have inter-ethnic problems. But once you have inter-ethnic problems, you have a problem with democracy in that it's going to go populist. And again, I would say perhaps Malaysian democracy started with populism. And of course, the basis for most populisms is race, ethnicity, and ethnic divides, and so on. In our case, we had the plural society base as our economic driver, and that made everything much more difficult. So for me, to study Malaysia and to even work at a think tank now in Penang, I think the concepts have to be looked at first, which we hardly ever do in our public discourses. We jump straight in and we do not problematize the word nation. We do not problematize the word state.
It seems like we're always like chasing after placing ambulances, putting out fires, and there are
Because
some
we thought that just by the Tunku shouting Merdeka 7 times, we were now a nation and a state. That's just not true. That's just not true, and we haven't gone through that. That I would say therapeutic period where we actually instead we fight it all out publicly.
Ordeal by fire, yeah.
Publicly, and that's why we have this thing about quite clear on both at the state level and the federal level, policy by press conference.
Yes.
Because there is not enough deep discussions about things, and therefore the politicians have to just pick up notions and ideas and concepts floating around, and then they try to make sense of it. And the press will just also pick that up and try to make sense of it or not. And then it goes on and on and on. And there is no proper discussion about leadership, about nationhood, about statehood, and why are we doing this, and in what larger context is Malaysia functioning. We hardly know what ASEAN is. ASEAN hardly knows what ASEAN is. And now, during the Cold War, things were polarized, so we sort of waited things out. After that, we had the unipolar world, and so we just went along with what America wanted. But now there's a real challenge on the world stage. We are unavoidably going towards a multipolar world, and there are those, of course, who are against that, especially the unipole. So history goes on and on and on. So at every point, you can say that the past is passing, the future is coming, right? So we are always on the top of a ridge, looking down on one side of what has been and looking down the other, the slope that you're going to roll down. And how are you going to roll down without hurting yourself, and so on, if I use that analogy, right? Now about nationhood, and in human history, you have had empires, different types of empires, and then you have the more localized polities that would be the basis for what we now call nation states. But there is always one stronger group than another, and how do you keep that balance between why should the stronger one hold itself back, and how would the weaker one stand up to the stronger one? So the idea of the United Nations and so on, I think, came out of the price paid in the First and the Second World War. The world had killed off so many millions of its humans that we was shocked at what we managed to do, including in atomic bombs. Yeah?
Yes.
And so we better come up with a system where states and nations, however small or big they are nominally equal, right? So Singapore, in certain contexts, has the same vote as China, for example. So that's the nation-state idea, right?
But would you say that perhaps statehood is older than nationhood?
Yeah. That's what I'm coming to. You then get the imperial or the empire factor, which was the older one. It went on for a few thousand years, and then the nationhood one is quite a new thing. But I would say that, of course, nationhood had, even without being expressed in the international United Nations sense that we have today, one could say that there were always little tribes and groups that would have been nations if it were modern times. But before we got to that point, there was always this element of the stronger guy controlling the others, and how you control the others. And in controlling them over time, they become part of you, right? Because culture spreads. Culture and language spreads much, much faster than blood spreads, right? So that creates a problem. You saw that in Germany in the Second World War, where there were many Jews who were as German as anybody, but their blood was slightly different. Things like that, or the Irish who speak better English than the English, but blood-wise, just a mix, right? So culture spreads more, and so the state, in this case, an empire, an emperor, and so on, controls a certain area, standardizes language, standardizes transport, standardizes the currency, and so on. And after 1, 2, 3 generations, this state, this empire, creates a nation. So enter the case of China, for example, that always claims that it's been 5,000 years.
Yes.
So the state, in some sense, they claim, has been around. And having been around for so long, it has created a nation that we call the Han Chinese. Right? DNA-wise, I'm sure the Northern Chinese is mixed in a way different from the Cantonese, for example. But the culture on top of that makes them agree with each other. So China is an interesting case in modern times. Many would say it's an empire trying to be a nation state, or an empire pretending to be a nation state. I don't know. But in that case, you have the USA being a nation that pretends to be an empire. So you can't only talk nations, about nations and states. You have to talk, there's an imperial factor underneath it. Today, after the COVID and so on, we do talk a lot about the global strategic situation and so on. One could just as well use the imperial discourse, that these two, the nation discourse and the empire discourse, actually move along. And you can't get rid of one or the other, because somebody is going to be stronger than the other, someone else. So it's about working out at two levels, working out how to have a stable nation and how to have stable multipolar a multipolar world. My conclusion now, after living 68 years, is that in the end, if we were rational enough, nation states will be social democratic as far as they can be. And where the imperial factor is concerned, we will have a multipolar world. And we will find a balance between social democratic nation states, because any large income gap is going to cause instability, right? So you need that kind of solution of some sort. I don't mean the Scandinavian type, it could be some other way as well. And then you have the stronger poles that you cannot deny, and whether they want to or not, just by being bigger and stronger than you, they're going to exert influence. And once they see that they exert influence, they will want to get the most out of that influence. For the smaller countries, you'll just have to, be strategic and create a defense that doesn't look like defense to offend the big guys.
You have to navigate very treacherous waters there.
Yeah, and that's where the human and political side is concerned. At the same time, while we're doing this, our environment is in trouble. So those are the major problems in the world today.
Well, I'd like to go back a few years. Actually, I mean, we've spoken about 1957 and not about that event specifically, but that era and the era of the formation of the Federation of Malaysia in 1963. We might be overlapping with what we've already talked about, but you're still in the process of becoming Dr. Uy. You say you're 68, but you're still growing and you're still developing, and that never stops. How are those events, independence and the formation of the Federation, important to you? More specifically, can you give everyday kind of examples of incidences and instances that were formative? So, for example, when I used to go to the immigration department to renew my wife's visa, I did that for about 10 years before she got her permanent residence. But every occasion in which I went to immigration department, whether in KL or Putrajaya, was always an occasion where questions arose in my head about independence and what it means. So can you relate the importance of independence and the formation of the Federation to your own experiences? Why are they important? What are they for? And more importantly, why are they important to you as a person? Can you give more of an everyday kind of...
If I, how shall I put it? If I use the the slogan of the French Revolution. Yeah. What is it? Liberty,
Fraternity, liberté, égalité,
and
brotherhood, freedom, and equality.
Equality, right? Now, if you are one prone to think of equality as the most important important ethos in humans, then you would tend to be socialist in some sense, right? But if you are keen on freedom, individual freedom, you will tend towards a more anarchistic way of looking at things. I think fraternity was thrown in just to have three words to shout. I think I think those two are the important ones and captures most of the things one could talk about in this context. So individually, I think freedom is key, and I think freedom to define it. A good friend of mine, my late father-in-law actually, Hugh Secker, he liked to say his slogan for life was "No coercion except to stop coercion." Right? Of course, that it's a difficult slogan, but no coercion to me. Then, after giving it much thought, I would say it's simply about mobility. If I'm allowed to leave the room if you're trying to bully me, then I'm free. It is when you can stop me from leaving the room that I'm not free, if we put it that way. So if I have money, I can travel. If I don't have money, I'm stuck. Right? The way we, in this part of the world, the way we treat foreign workers, for example, is that we control their movement. And then, so to be more cynical and skeptical about the world order, nation states are exactly a control of movement. And therefore your passports and your bad experiences with getting a passport, getting visas, leaving the country, entering a country, these are all barriers, right? One could see them as prisons, if you like. But that's the human condition, right? The more people there are, the more we have to control movement, because movements, and especially when travel is easy, movements of large groups of people are going to cause chaos. Just like the Syrian refugee flow into Europe a few years ago. Why Singapore makes sure that it can control immigration. Malaysia too accept that our borders are porous, so we have I don't know how many million illegals and so on. So if I keep myself to the personal level, the most important principle to me is actually freedom expressed in that way, mobility. So if I scold my child, she must have the right to walk out of the room, and that way she has that basic definition of freedom at his or her hand. When it comes to groups, then suddenly we have to have a sense of fairness and so on, right? And allowing people to have their integrity. And I think a lot of integrity is undermined by the fact that that our mobility is curbed. And since we are kids, you go to school, you have to stay there at certain hours, change different classes. So you're in a way locked down, and you learn to accept that over a certain period of time, you're not allowed to leave this place and so on, even if you feel really bored and so on, right? That was one of the main reasons my kids are homeschooled, so that they didn't have to be bullied in school. They can still learn anyway. And I never liked school. I like you rightly said, I love learning. Not learning for the sake of learning. I have to learn to understand the world as holistically as I can. And I found school, if I look back on school, I mean, it wasn't bad and all that. It wasn't very effective. And what you were made to learn was always decided by someone else. It wasn't organic, right? And I think in reaction to that, when I was living in Sweden, you had the welfare system and so on. That was when I thought I would just move around. So I studied public administration at first. That's my first degree. Then I went into Western philosophy and learned quite a bit about that, but much of it I didn't like. I didn't quite understand. And I went into Eastern philosophy, largely political philosophy. And largely, when you study ancient China, which in the end was my PhD, it's very secular. So their philosophy is not religious at all. So that's the fascinating thing about Chinese civilization, really. It was secular from day one, thanks to Confucius and that period of thinkers, just like the Greeks in a way. So you had this philosophical burst, in China, as you had in Greece and India too, I suppose. So that's what I always wanted to do. I've been told off by friends for thinking too much and so on, and I never quite understood ever when they say, why do you think so much? And I think, what is it you do? Of course, we think our brain can't stop doing things, and in the end, it's society and the modern world and how people are treated and not treated, and how people live their lives that becomes of interest. And therefore my interest in the social sciences and in the humanities. I started out as a science student, but again, that's something what was wrong with our school system. If you're doing well, you go into the sciences, and that's where you become a laborer, a salaried person. Now there's this point, maybe I should take it up here. This was a point made to me by the great Professor Wang Kangwu, right? Malaysia's best intellectual product, I think. He was just thinking, so we take it as that, just throwing out the line, that during colonial times, of course, the British ruling Malaya and Singapore from so far away needed educated people to help them run the place. You need engineers, doctors, so on and so forth. And so they steered the best brains into those professions, or into administration and so on. And so it became the habit for us, and it continued after independence. You put your best brains into STEM. We still do that. And the global economics, the global capitalists have a system where we still put our best brains into STEM projects. And
to run the machinery, in a sense.
To run the machinery, and I think many people who go into these high-level professions, high-level studies, later on they're surprised that they become workers. They're actually salaried people, but they're the best brains. Why are they salaried? And the joke going around is that people from the A and B class, they go off and study in wherever, and then they come back and they work for the kids who were in the C and D class, who are now business people. There's some truth to that. But to continue my what I wanted to say, while all this was happening in the colonies, what were the British doing? Of course, they had their sciences and so on, but their leaders were going, their elites were going into the humanities. PPE. It might not be the CE, for example, because through those studies, you learn how to think on your feet. You become you become a generalist, and leaders need to be generalists, make decisions fast, and know enough about the world to make those decisions, right? That I find to be extremely interesting. To what extent it might be applicable to the world, I don't know, but that applies to me. That's how I would have seen the world. The sciences I thought bloody boring in a world that was changing so fast and so on, and I'm going to just do maths. So I went into literature and so on. All my kids do that now. I push them there because not only might that be what is needed in the future, but it makes them more rounded in how they think. It makes them very bad computer people or whatever, right? But yeah.
Not as useful, perhaps, as those who can fix
It's
the
about,
things
again,
in
back
the
to
system.
the liberty of the individual, you see. If you do not have liberty, you can't have integrity. Because if you don't grow up with enough liberty, you're bound to lie, you're bound to be a shyster, you're bound to hide things, you're bound to keep silent about things, hide truths, and so on and so forth. And as you do that, something happens to you.
Yes.
You perpetuate your subordinate role.
Yeah.
So I tell my kids and whoever will listen that the reason you don't lie is not because you will go to hell. You don't lie because you are then admitting and perpetuating your role in your own head that you are inferior.
Yes. There's something to hide.
You have something to hide, and probably the person exerting power wants you to lie.
Yeah.
Because that weakens you, and you are now more in his power because you had to hide from him. You see my point?
Yes.
That's at the individual level. At the individual level, everybody should be an anarchist. At the social level, everybody should be a social democrat. Yeah, that's how I think. And at the all human level, I think we should all be scientific, humanists, and so on. That would be my simplification of what I've learned in 68 years.